to see if Miles wants to talk. It's still open. All right. What I kind of wanted to talk about today, or tonight, like the main thing that I really wanted to talk about is something that I'm getting really pilled on is just rhetoric and terms. So what I mean by that is I think people have a very surface level understanding of terminology and how we use words and just the usage of words, right? And the reason why I say that is because every single time people talk about rhetoric and people talk about like discourse on Twitch and all this stuff, I think there's some things missing. And I have some like frustrations about Twitch politics and what the debate or discussion thing is. And I want to try to kind of convey my thoughts on it. So this is another, I guess you would say, prepared portion of content where I actually wrote notes. Isn't that crazy? So what I have here is this big old thing, and I kind of want to talk about like just some shit, right? Because I've had some shit on my mind and mind on my shit. It's almost as though they'd rather talk about rhetoric than people dying and having their lives ruined because of policy. Yeah. So let me just make my stance clear from the jump, because we might get to some like unscripted pieces of this. Not really scripted, but just like open-ended thoughts. And we might get a little weird. Is this about so I made a tweet talking about the 4Ds of conversations. And people were really confused what I was talking about. So what I wanted to do is first like talk about what I consider the 4Ds, what they are, and what they do, right? So the first thing you got to understand is that when it comes to conversations, I would argue that there's only 4 dimensions within the conversation, and then that splices out to 2 types, which are competitive and cooperative. Basically, you have competitive conversation, where it's this idea of like a clear winner or loser, and then you have cooperative, which is this idea of like the sort of the meme that's in sort of Twitch politics right now, which is we're just going to have a talk. We're just going to have a nice little talk and conversation. That's all we're having. And when in reality, it turns into this fucking scream fest of like just rage and other stuff. So the reason why I think this happens, and this is like tip number 1.
I know Joe. He is a profoundly decent man, guided by faith.
If Michelle believes it, it must be true. The first thing that I think you need to do from the jump is try to identify, if you're going to run into these one-on-one conversations with people on the internet in this space, is try to figure out what the conversation is going into it. Or better yet, what the panel is going into it, right? So what I want to lay out are the 4 types of conversations, and then like splitting them into different parts. So the first thing you got to understand is that you have debate, which is competitive 2-way conversation. The goal is to win an argument or convince someone, such as the other participant or like a third party observer, right? This is where I think, I don't know if you can see this well. Hopefully you can. If not, let me know. I can make some like adjustments on here. I think it's pretty clear, I think. This is where I think the talks on Twitch inevitably go to, even if they start out as cooperative. My contention is that a lot of the interchanging and the exchanges of conversations don't necessarily have to go to debate, right? Like, so
I know Joe.
As Fad brought up, now we got a hypey train. And Michelle's going to be talking a lot, and I don't know how to mute my notifications, so it's going to be a fun little ride. We have one more for a hypey hype train, by the way. No pressure, but I want to get my car fixed. Okay. But so anyway, If debate, which is two-way conversation, the goal is to win an argument or convince someone, such as the other participant or third-party observers. Diatribe is a competitive one-way conversation. The goal is to express emotions, browbeat those that disagree with you, or and or impresses the I put and or impresses those that share the same perspective, right? So what that looks like is when you're in a competitive conversation, those are the two things that are kind of happening in real time. So what you'll have is sort of two-way conversation that is actually debate of ideas going back and forth. The goal is to try to convince people into a certain place. What I think happens a lot, I think it has something to do with just how where we're having these conversations online, and also just respect of the other individual, is that we participate a lot in diatribe. So, which again, it's just competitive one way, and the goal is to express emotions, browbeat those who disagree with you, or impress those who share like the same perspective. And I think thanks for the big old biddies. I think that's where a lot of the conversations kind of stay at, is like diatribing back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, just back and forth diatribes. Sometimes we end up into conversations that are actually debates, which can be kind of interesting, but I don't necessarily think that every single conversation is required to end up into debate or even diatribe, which goes to the next two, right? Dialogue is a cooperative two-way conversation, and the goal is for participants to exchange information and build relationships with each other. Now, the issue is that so many people fall into the trap of a conversation being a dialogue, and then it ends up being a diatribe, ends up being a debate, and it ends up like cooperative conversation ends up being competitive conversation. And while do I think that like all conversations dwell in like exclusively one category? No, that's not true. We've had, like, as all of us know, because we all exist outside of the internet, like you'll have something along the lines of, you start out with a conversation being competitive where you're like diatribing back and forth, and then maybe it ends up being cooperative because you find like a middle ground on something. Maybe within that middle ground you end up going into debate. Like, conversations can always shift and they have ebb and flow. However, something that's been happening a lot on Twitch is that we keep pulling towards this type of thing. I feel like we keep pulling towards diatribe, and we don't even know what's happening in real time. Another thing within cooperative conversation is discourse. And discourse is one-way conversation. The goal is to deliver information from the person who's talking to the listeners. So what that looks like, right? So something that can happen, and this is very tricky to navigate, and I don't even know what the correct way of action is, when you're in a debate, right? And you're in a debate like structure, right? Or diatribing. You're like, somebody is diatribing, and like they're just like going full hard, just diatribing on something, and then the other individual sees something that's wrong in the diatribe and then starts participating in discourse. So again, one-way conversation, and the goal is to deliver information from the speaker to the listener. So what that looks like, right, and this is where I get really like, is that sometimes you'll have people who start off just like they're diatribing at you, you respond with discourse. When I'm saying these things like diatribe responding to discourse, debate responding with dialogue, it's again, like, I'm not saying that these are like these fixed things. Like, these are not fixed definitions, not necessarily the fixed definitions, but I'm just using them this way just to explain like what happens, like the exchange of a thing. So like, you're never going to say like, you're participating in discourse, well, I am participating in diatribe. Nobody is that weird. But basically what happens is somebody delivers something, it's information that might necessarily not feel like a counter of the diatribe, but it's going to feel like diatribing in real time. Because what happens is when we talk about diatribe, right? Diatribe is, again, competitive one way, and the goal is to express emotions, browbeat those that disagree with you, or inspire those with the same perspective, right? So you might be like, just, hark the herald angels singing, this dude is a piece of shit. This is why this dude's an asshole, and I'm not gonna take his shit. But then, maybe within that, the person they're talking to hears something that's like factually not necessarily the case, and then you start participating in discourse. So basically, the idea that I'm trying to lay out here is that sometimes within exchanges, um, you might think that you and the person you're talking to are playing the same song. In reality, sometimes you're not. And what you got to do, I think, is try to identify in real time when that happens. Um, and I try my best to put people in frameworks to try to do that. There's a bunch of ways that you can do that. But yeah, let's keep going. So, rhetoric. I keep hearing this word used, and it's just so the thing that I'm doing now, which I think everybody should try to do, is at the very least, when you hear someone say something, you just look it up. So even when I look in the dictionary definition of rhetoric, it says the art of effective or persuasive speaking or writing, especially that uses figures of speech and other compositional techniques. So what we're going to do over the next couple minutes is talk about not only some of these techniques, but also just kind of give you guys a better understanding of what people mean when they say rhetoric, right? So if I was going to do a stream to critique somebody's rhetoric or how they're relaying their ideas, right, I would talk about the techniques that they're using. I would talk about the types of dialogue that are happening, and like, okay, why does this feel like discourse but it's actually diatribe? Why does this feel like a competitive conversation when it's actually a cooperative conversation? That's really important. But I think what happens so often is that the term rhetoric gets thrown around, and you get people who like say unironically, like, I'm the rhetoric guy online. And it's like, okay, cool, if you're the rhetoric guy online, that's all well and good, but there are better ways to expand on this in a nonpartisan way of the individuals to really convey those ideas. And I think there's a lot of things educationally that are just getting lost in the sauce, mainly because those who are on Twitch who talk about education don't really have ever educated anybody on anything. And hot take. But what I mean by that is, right, it's very easy to talk to people about things that you know, but to be able to, in a one way asterisk conversation on Twitch, you have to understand that, like, what this is, like, this level of like trying to educate people on something is a skill, and you gotta like do it always and understand, like, just teach. And again, it sounds so fucking, I hate doing this because it sounds like I'm saying that you got to be educated if you want to educate people, and that's not what I'm saying. But the things that you use when you're trying to educate people on topics is very important, because a lot of people won't know these things that you might be describing. So I think what you need to do is dedicate your content in such a way that talks about these things at mass. So like something that I would do if I was going to have like a conversation, like a deep dive conversation about like, and like if my stream was dedicated to this, right? Dedicated to showing you guys and trying to make you guys better conversationalists online, is that I'd probably spend a lot of time talking about diatribe and discourse, diatribe versus discourse, debate versus dialogue, how these conversational things shift, how to set yourself up in a way where you understand the shift and how you bring it back to something that's in your favor. Those are all things that are very, very important. Like, I don't care about the substance of people have for their arguments. I don't give a shit about their arguments, actually. And again, it sounds contradictory if we're talking about rhetoric, but like what I want are better conversations. You can use this with a better understanding of rhetoric, but also think that we just got to do a better job at conversing with people and giving people just a little bit more charitability in the way that they talk. Because basically, when we talk about these rhetoric terms and all this bunch of big fucking words, is that people do not walk into conversations actively thinking about the rhetorical tools that they're going to use in the conversation. It's just how they talk. And very often people think like, oh, you're just using these rhetorical tactics to convince the like I hear this in people's language when they're talking to people online. It's like, no. Like people can have poor rhetoric and you can try to improve your rhetoric, but I would argue most people who navigate online are not really looking to improve their rhetoric in such a way so that they can be effective in Twitch debates or debates on the internet. That's like the smoothest take I could think of. And hey, if you want to slide down the hills, go for it. But like people don't participate in rhetoric online in such a way where they're trying to like actively convince individuals. Does that happen? Sure. But I'd say at mass, people aren't actively using these things and knowingly using these things and being able to define these things. So what I want to do is kind of walk through some of them that I've seen a lot in my past year talking to people on the internet. And by talking about these things, I want you guys to kind of like walk away with just like, hey, I'm slightly better at understanding this thing. That's it, right? So, rhetoric. There's three things that kind of that I don't think I spelled this word right. There are three things that kind of like matter when it comes to rhetoric, and there's like rhetorical devices, but we're gonna talk about like the big three, right? So we have forensic, epileptic, and deliberative. So basically you have talking about the past, talking about the present, talking about the future. So forensic usually talks about facts and using facts to frame certain portions of your argument. Now, granted, there are people in my space who study persuasive comm. And they're probably going to be like, Joe, you're omitting a bunch of shit. But what about the analysis of the forensic? I'm like, shut the fuck up. I want this in such a way where people can just absorb what they can and get the fuck out. If I wanted to do a deep dive about all this, I would actually just like charge money for it. Okay? But so let's just power through. So generally speaking, forensic, epileptic, and deliberative is talking about the past, present, and future. So forensic, judicial, facts. Using facts to form your arguments and using the past to inform parts of your argument. I do this all the time. Like, you hear me sigh and then go on some discourse about some type of like thing that somebody's missing about the history of race was going to help the conversation move in such a way where it's not this giant circle jerk of discourse. Or sorry, circle jerk of like diatribe and false debating or faux debating. Epileptic, demonstrative, is talking about the present. So usually what I try to do, again, I don't actively think about doing this, but it's just something that like through watching myself talk, I realize I do this, is I lay out certain facts and stuff like that, and then I try my best to connect it to the present. So starting from the past with facts, and then using that to start talking about the present. Now, when we're talking about, like, say, race in the United States, one of the problems is with using, like, forensic versus epileptic, right, is that I'll just call it out, some people just they don't accept what you consider present, right? So I consider the 1960s present history. I consider the 70s and 80s the present. Is it the immediate right now that keeps passing in real time? No, but people who are alive then are alive now. So this is the now, in the now. Then you have deliberative, which is talking about the future. It's a word that I tried to remember how to spell. But I'm not gonna like butcher myself in talking about it now, right? Is basically talking about the future. Politicians do this shit um, all the fucking time, where they say this bill isn't going to work because we got to think about the when you're on the table and 10 years from now and you can't feed your family, we're going to look back and it's because of this bill. Same thing with the crime bill, sorry, the PROA, the Personal Accountability Work Responsibility Act. Bill Clinton argued within the deliberative, where he's like, if we look back to this time and it or sorry, if we go to the future and nothing happens, it's a failure on all of us. So it's like, if we go to the future, in the future, if this thing is not good, then we failed. Everybody failed, but really it's just kind of the government. But anyway, you also have things like appeals, but we'll get to that, right? So the next thing I want to talk about is just like appeals and what you do, right? So an appeal is like catering oversimplified to someone or something. So you have the big three: ethos, logos, and pathos. I'm now invoking the soul of dead white guys, because if we're going to talk about rhetoric, we got to talk about dead white guys. Yo, give me like 30 minutes. This should be pretty quick. But yeah, we'll talk right after, Miles. Big three: ethos, logos, pathos. Evoking dead white guys. Here we go. All right, so ethos. Convincing through credibility. What that looks like is I worked in the healthcare industry my entire life. That's a convincing through credibility. You say something in such a way and you use your experience as a way to acknowledge why it should be treated seriously. Convincing through credibility also, like when you hear people say like, well, as a trans person or as a trans man or as a trans woman, blah, 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 blah. As a black man, blah, 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 blah. As a white woman, blah, 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 blah. You get the idea? So just convincing through credibility. And you use certain things like to show your credibility and how what you're talking about. Logos is the one that I think everybody on Twitch participates in far too much, which is logic and reason, baby. Using analogies, examples, stats, using facts to convince people. And the reason why I put ethos, logos, and pathos all together is that it's kind of like a perfect harmony. You kind of have to we all push towards different parts of it. And I think the goal is to try to be somewhere in the middle, somewhere perfectly balanced. The way all things shit. So we don't really need to spend any time talking about logos. We hear it all the time. I'm hoping you understand that we hear about analogies, examples, statistics, graphs, stats, lots using like. I hope we all understand. We hear this in nauseum on the internet. The other one is pathos, which is appealing to emotion. There are different ways of appealing to emotion, but generally speaking, it can manifest itself in different ways, which we'll probably get to in different types of rhetorical devices. Just a thing. Types of rhetoric and shit. That's what I wrote. Types of rhetoric and shit. We also have people that literally aren't good at logic telling people to be logical. That is also true. So rhetoric is a tool or technique of using language effectively and persuasively. So what does that mean? We all use rhetoric in our lives, and it's a learned skill. Rhetoric devices is just a tool people use for a bunch of different reasons. Maybe they overlap. I don't fucking know. What's up, Sage? So basically what happens is like we don't even consciously know that we're using rhetorical devices in real time. We just do them. And I think something that's important if you're wanting to understand, like, okay, why is this conversation weird? Why is this like not hitting the right way? Or what the fuck is going on? Like, maybe taking a step back and being like, okay, what's being used in this conversation that's making it yikes? Like, what's getting missed here in the conversational portion within the 4Ds? Like, maybe somebody's participating too much in logos that they just ignore ethos and pathos, like shit like that. So here are some rhetorical devices. Again, they're used like to persuade the listener or speaker. They can take like, taking particular positions, even if they may not be the one that they truthfully hold. Like rhetorical devices you can use not only for your arguments, but maybe to reinforce other arguments that you don't even agree with. This is why like certain individuals online, like it feels like they don't really hold the position that they're saying that they do. And maybe that's because they're not really using rhetorical devices in such a way that makes them convincing. Which is why sometimes when you hear people say things, look no further than the charm hole situation, that maybe these aren't even positions that this person holds and they're just trolling you. So let's run these down a little bit too quick. So, Joe, could you differentiate the ethos and logos bit? Wouldn't trying to convince through credibility be an example of logos? Because you do have to prove something's credibility, if not the faction example of it. I mean, I learned this in my rhetorical class. Yeah, so like, TLDR, you don't really, like, ethos and logos, there is like crossover in all three of these things. However, one thing that somebody might use that's not logos is going back to their credibility or acknowledging the credibility for their argument exclusively. So they'll say things like, because I've heard this happen, and I forget which debate this was. Like, so imagine a conversation where they default all the time that they do community action. Actually, Mike from PA. So there was a conversation, I don't remember which one it was, but Mike from PA continually insisted that a reason that he should be taken seriously is because of the things that he did. And despite the fact that there were some things there that people were just disagreeing with, right? That was just like, what are you talking about? This is like not how any of this worked. He kept insisting that like, no, it's because, and you like, what community action have you done? I've done bop 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 bop. Instead of using like analogies, examples, and maybe not statistics, but like analogies, examples, and like other like facts within your credibility to reinforce what you're trying to say. Does that make sense? I hope it does. So moving on. And again, these things aren't like perfect. It makes it incredibly clear, right? So we all float in these like three. Oh shit.
It ain't much, but it's honest money, sacco di soldi, sorriso con goccia di sudore.
I have no idea what she just said to me. I appreciate that. Yeah, so I need to change that threshold because you guys are great. Thank you. Let's move on a little bit. So here are some of the devices, right? The first one are rhetorical questions. Again, I'm going to say these just for the sake of like this conversation. It wasn't me. Stop it, Miles. So questions asked not expecting an answer and are so obvious they do not need to be. It's asked to make a point. This is something that Twitch panelists, I would argue, myself included, sometimes really fail at when it comes to rhetorical arguments. So a rhetorical question has to be so goddamn obvious, and it's being used to prove a point, right? So the best example that I can think of So I got CTV on my mind, is when I asked him, are you shitting on my dick right now? That's a rhetorical question when talking to CTV on the internet. Because, of course, he's not shitting on my dick right now. Because, one, that's TOS. Two, we're on the internet. And three, we're states apart. But the point is what he was saying felt very ridiculous to me. Does that make sense? So that's like a decent usage of a rhetorical question. But sometimes what happens is, what people get in trouble with, is that they use a rhetorical question for their argument, and the rhetorical question has enough nuance where it can't be used to reinforce that said point. And that happens a lot. Love to assert my cause. Ben Shapiro keeps saying he isn't racist because he's a target of hate groups, but he's terrified of people fighting for his safety. Sounds sus to me. Yeah, it does. Next one, analogies. This is easy. A comparison used to prove a point. We're going to skip that. An anecdote, a story used to prove a point. So often online, I hear people saying, like, oh, it's just an anecdote. Oh, that's just an anecdote. That's just an anecdote. Like, just discrediting anecdotes for people's points. And the thing is, which really annoys me, is that the anecdote is used to prove a point. So if you have a problem with the anecdote, I think that you need to have a problem with the point. And I don't know how to explain that in real time. Where if you're listening to an anecdote and you don't agree with that, then I think sometimes it might be better to talk about the statement. My other favorite is the N-word debate of Destiny. What is this take? Right, that's a rhetorical question. Because we know what the take is. The take is them talking. Anyway, yeah, we're talking about the N-word tonight. The N-word talk tonight. A never-ending conversation. It's a good conversation. It just gets a little yikers. Oddly, accelerationally more yikes. I feel like it's not really like a full-on like deep dive. We'll find out. A simile, it's just a comparison using like or as. That's it. We don't have to really go through that. A metaphor is a connection between two things to show that they are the same. People use metaphors a lot to talk about Republicans and Democrats, where, especially when it comes to certain policies, where people argue, I argue sometimes that Republicans and Democrats are the same, and you use connections between those two parties to show that they are the same. One way is like, I did. It's funny. It's not funny. I got a laugh. I got a little laugh from the beginning because you invoked an individual, and I was just like, oh no. Not in a bad way, of just like, yep. An illusion, illusion with an A. A brief and indirect reference to a person, place, thing, or idea of history and cultural literacy or political significance. So, I'll give you the pilled example. The only example that I can give you. I'm just going to say a name, and you're going to know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm going to say conservatives, Dr. Martin Luther King. We're going to keep going. So, an illusion, again, is a brief and indirect reference to a person, place, thing, or idea of historical, cultural, literacy, or political significance. And the example I'm going to give you is righties, Dr. King. Repetition is saying something multiple times to make it clear or to drive it home, like for emphasis. Here's the one that I put together that I might have to kind of explain a bit more. So, Exclamation is language with strong feeling. And invectives is language that attacks, demonizes, or discredits a person's topic, idea, blah, blah, blah. Something that happens, especially online, is that these two things kind of go hand in hand. Another thing that happens is people discredit people when they participate in exclamation. And I don't think that's necessarily okay. I think exclamation, not even I think, it's just exclamation is used to, it's language with strong feeling. That language could be just your volume of your words, how you say these things. What happens sometimes is when people do get heated and hotter in a conversation is that they start using invectives, right? So they use invectives to create attacks, denounce or discredit individuals, like all this stuff, right? And this is where I think we got to be more aware of what's happening. Just because somebody participates, right, in exclamation doesn't mean they're attacking you. A conversation that comes to mind that's handled this very, very well is Dr. Daheem Doubt when he was talking to Mel. Sometimes Mel would participate in an exclamation. Same thing with CTV. CTV, Phil KOE. They are the perfect examples of exclamation, especially Phil. The problem is that people think that, like, when somebody is, how do we say this? When somebody gets hot and heavy, they're not getting hot and heavy because they're disrespecting you. It's just how they talk, right? So when like Phil KOE talks, and we saw this against Jake, is that just because he's getting like energetic doesn't mean that his point is invalid. And sometimes what you have to do, I think, especially with people who participate in exclamation, is just take a beat and just listen. Like, amplify your listening. Or sensitize because they're talking too loud. I don't know which one. Parallel structure. Oh, God. Parallel structure is using words or phrases that are not the same, but have the same structure. People use this all the fucking time. Either you support this or you support that. No, you're not listening to what I'm saying. Exclamation. You're not listening to what I'm saying. Either you support this or you support that. So which one do you actually support? That type of shit. Paradoxes. There's statements of contradiction that seem nonsensical but invokes some measure of truth. Right. We don't have to like get into that shit. Not a lot of people do paradoxes, but it is a statement of contradiction that seems nonsensical but invokes some measure truth. Oxymorons are two words that are usually contradictory, opposite, but are placed side by side, like black conservative. Like this is an what's a good, let me think of one. This is an undecidable decision. Sorry, what? We took the unimaginary and made it imaginary. Oh, we made the impossible possible. That type of shit. I put anaphora and epiphora together. Basically, anaphora is repetition at the beginning. Anaphora is repetition at the end. So here is an example of anaphora, repetition at the beginning. Power for whites, power for blacks, power for Hispanics, power for Asians, power for all people. Anaphora, repetition in the beginning, repetition in the end. You ready for this one? One world. Sorry. Actually, no. That was the anaphora one was supposed to be the other one. I was supposed to do a Winter Soldier reference. I forgot what it was, so I ad-libbed. Another example of anaphora, for those of you who are watching Falcon and the Winter Soldier, this is not a fucking spoiler, so don't and get your headphones. One world, one people. That's an example of anaphora. Another example of a epiphora would be power to white people, power to black people, power to Asian people, power to blah, 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 indigenous people. That has both, actually. One in the front, one in the end. Not a lot of people use these. Hypophora. I love this one. People do this a lot. Hypophora is when you ask a question and then you continue the answer to the question for the audience. So what happens is when people do this, they think that like when you're online and you're doing like hyperphoria, is that they'll ask a question and then they keep going, and then the person who they're responding to thinks that they're talking to them, when in reality they're just doing it for the audience at large. And sometimes that happens. You got to catch that. Like, is the person talking to me, or is the person talking to y'all? In the here. Like, sometimes people will just talk to the audience and they're not talking to you. And anyway, so antithesis is a figure of balance when contrasting ideas are intentionally put at odds. So what that looks like is you take two ideas that are complete opposites, you cram them together to just kind of like expose them. Not a lot of people do this, to the best of my memory. All right. Tropes, figures of speech in which words carry meaning other than the moral sense. People sometimes do this with ACAB. They do this with ACAB. And defund the... Actually, maybe not ACAB. Maybe more so defund the police. Definitely would defund the police. The next two, we have to play a video. So let's play this really quickly.
You've been waiting for Conjunction Junction.
Ooh, shit.
Conjunction Junction, what's your function?
Hooking up words and phrases and clauses.
All right. That's all you need to know. Conjunctions. All right. So conjunctions are and, or, and but. The next two people use all the fucking time. So, a syndeton is a normal conjunction. Well, rather, when normal conjunctions are purposely omitted in a string of words. This policy is going to help blacks, Asians, whites, trans folks, gay folks, not that in the way folks. You get the idea. You just ignore conjunctions. Polysyndeton, two great band names, by the way. Also two great gamer tags. Is the deliberate and excessive use of conjunctions in successive words. This is going to help the blacks and Asians and Spanish and Latinx and trans folks and gay folk. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, both of which hit different. Sometimes people use like polysyndeton to like drive a point home. So you're using the conjunction to bring up the fact that maybe a lot of people are included into something. Like, this is going to include, like, this policy isn't going to work. It's going to include the blacks. It's going to, I gotta stop saying the blacks. It's going to include African Americans, white people. And Asian. We're going to go to Vermont and Georgia and Idaho and Texas and yeah, you get it? Okay, all right. Concessions. This one is very slippery. Concessions are acknowledging the opponent's argument to show understanding and consideration of the issue, right? And something that happens is people do not enjoy concessions. I enjoy concessions. I personally like large popcorn, no drink, water. That's the true tech, the true balance. But a lot of people do not enjoy concessions. So you acknowledge the opponent's what the person's saying, and you show understanding and consideration of the thing. Agreeing with someone isn't consideration, in my opinion. So what this looks like is people will say like, blah, 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 and I agree with you, but I'm going to shit on everything you just said. So it's like, no. Like, something that is very important in the concession that might make you really better at conversing online would be acknowledging what somebody's saying to you, like what your opponent's argument is, and then showing consideration of that, and maybe even talking about it. You think you could make this into a shareable doc? Sure. I could clean it up so it's a little bit easier to understand. So the Holy Trinity, which are the other things, like, when I say Holy Trinity, I mean that, like, these three things go hand in hand, right? So you want credibility, emotions, and logic with your arguments, in my opinion. I think you need all three to make you... Okay, let me say this in the nicest way possible. I think you need all three to sound like a normal human being when you're talking to people online, especially. One of the reasons is because we don't have the same type of nonverbals that would exist in like an in-person conversation. So something that happens very, very often is that a reason why some people feel like machines when they're having like these sort of discussions on the internet is that maybe they're participating too much in sort of credibility and logic with no emotions. Maybe they're participating with a lot of emotions and credibility, but maybe within those emotions and credibility, there's no real like logic in what they're saying. Like, the credibility is fine, the emotions is fine. Like, that's all well and good, but maybe you need a little bit more logic for your arguments. Maybe you have credibility. Sorry, what was the last one I missed? I missed a combination. Maybe you have emotions and maybe you have logic, but maybe you need a little bit more credibility, right? Because something that happens is, right, you see this all the time, people will like participate in like a very strong emotional argument, maybe using logic and stuff like that. And then you ask them like, you don't have any like, hey, Hosanna, you know where we're going tonight, okay? You know exactly where the raid's going tonight. Anyway, so that's my point. Like, you need all three, but when you're listening to conversations and why something might feel very hollow and empty, maybe somebody's missing one of the three of the Holy Trinity. And as Drezzy brought up, it's used in commercials all the time. They use all three. All the time. Okay, I put hypothetical questions here. And the last thing I'm going to talk about. hypothetical questions are questions asked to reveal opinions and beliefs. The question is not based on facts, but an imaginary situation. So, one of the things that I think is incredibly important is knowing when to use a hypothetical and understanding why someone might be using a hypothetical on you. You're saying that hypotheticals are not based. What's the worst hypothetical you heard? In the okay, I'm gonna try to say this without laughing. In the N-word conversation that I ran into on Prime Stream, Destiny asked me, in an imaginary world, let's say it's World War II, peak World War II, peak Nazi Germany, a group of Jewish folks decide to make an album, make music, and it's full of Jewish slurs and other Jewish types of whatever the fuck. And then you find out that it's profitable. Like the Nazis find out that it's profitable, and then they want to use it they're on. Sorry, the rest of the hypothetical. You see how fucking ridiculous this is. The rest of the hypothetical is that, and they're the only people who will be consuming it are Nazis. It just falls apart. So the thing is about hypothetical questions, which is kind of important for me, is that they tend to deal with scenarios and actions that might happen. And something that you don't have to do is participate in the hypothetical with this level of like absolute. There's another video. What is this? I think I know what this is.
This is a real B&H customer story. Jack and Barbara, professional wildlife photographers and B&H customers for 30 years, live in remote Alaska.
Hey, let's try this. Okay. Oh my God, they're gonna get all of their fucking ad revenue on this one. Okay, so oh God, I this is live. We're gonna do this shit live. So, it's a B&H customer story. These are individuals that live in remote Alaska and they're wildlife photographers. So one thing that they're doing right now is they're talking about just like the facts of the situation. And just so we're clear here, right? So credibility, emotions, logic. Credibility, emotions, logic. One part of credibility is that they are photographers in remote Alaska, but they can also be considered a fact.
Hey, what's the population there?
About 50 to 52 people.
Facts.
And bears.
We're definitely not in New York anymore.
You could say that, again, just facts.
It's just quiet here. It's beautiful. The wildlife photography out here is amazing.
Emotion. And also, maybe even credibility. These are probably their photos.
While they could order equipment from any number of sites, they don't.
Anytime we need anything, B&H is our go-to. We can
credibility a little bit.
Send an email. We have used the chat feature, and of course the phone if our phones are working.
And different things that are showing the validity of why they use them.
Phones are working.
Hi, Jack. What can I help you with?
I needed a tripod, and it had to be light. It had to be sturdy. So I talked with somebody at B&H. I think his name is Charles, and he pointed me toward a certain tripod and liked it so much that I bought a second one.
Nice one, Charles.
When it comes to getting gear, things were shipped quickly, packed well, made it through the harrowing journey, going from plane to smaller plane to somebody's hand, thrown to somebody else. But
So something that she's laying out here, which is very speculation. That's true. Very true. There's no way confirming that, right? Something that you could say is that, like, one part of the emotional argument is, like, you want to have the peace of mind that you're getting the thing that you ordered, and it's going to come to you in such a way that, like, is it going to be rough, tuckled, and fucked up? So they're saying that, like, they're using these things of credibility, like examples of their credibility, to show that there's peace of mind. So peace of mind is an emotion, right? Right?
put in the back of a truck and arrives unscathed.
That's quite the schlep. It must be incredible when it gets there.
Oh,
It must be incredible when it gets there.
it's like Christmas.
It's like Christmas. So the fact that they do all these things leads to an emotional response.
I mean, honestly, it's better than Christmas.
Better than Christmas. I don't believe that.
Yeah, it's my birthday.
Oh, birthday. More again, these are just like invoking different emotions, right? Because like, what does it feel like on your birthday? What does it feel like on Christmas?
B&H has everything that we need. I mean, when have we ever looked for something and it wasn't available?
Well, there was bananas.
Yeah, right.
Bananas indeed. Wherever you...
Boom, like it's relatable, it's all this stuff. So again, like advertisers also are very aware of that triangle. Now, are they actively sitting there like we need to put more ethos in our ad. We got to send it back. There's not enough ethos. They're not fucking doing that. They're just so good at it that you don't even know it's fucking happening. Which, again, it's again, and they'll use credibility to connect to emotion, and then they'll use facts to connect to emotion. Maybe they'll use emotion to connect to facts. It's just this perfect trinity of stuff. All right, so here's this thing about hypotheticals.
We funny people. I was over my brother's house last night. Before I left here, I was over my brother's house. And I got, nephew like all of us. They I don't know what they on. They on some other shit, right? So I was sitting up there talking to my brother, we playing pool. And my nephew came in and he said, you pretty smart. I said, well, I'm all right. I'm all right, He said, what's the difference between a hypothetical question and a realistic question? Kind of caught me off guard, I said, damn, hypothetical and realistic. I said, they basically mean the same, but sometimes they might be different. Caught me off guard. I said, for example, man, I said, run upstairs and ask your mama, would she make love to the next door neighbor for $50,000? He went upstairs, took a little while, came back. He said, mama said she'd make love to the next door neighborhood in the next block for $50,000. I said, I'll be damned. I said, well, do me a favor, go upstairs and ask your sister, would she make love to the mailman for $250,000? He ran upstairs, tried it on back. He said, sister said she'd make love to the mailman, the milkman, and any other man for $50,000. I looked at my brother. Brother looked at me. I said, sit down, son. I said, I'm going to tell you something. Hypothetically speaking, you should have $100,000. I said, but realistically speaking, son, you live with 2 hoes. Good night, Las Vegas. Good night.
Oh, that's actually really good. That's actually good. I'm proud of myself that I set that video aside. Okay, so do we need to break it down? I think we got to break it down. Okay, so hypothetically speaking, would you sleep with the man across the street for $50,000? Son goes up to his mother. Mother says yes. So that's $50,000. Then he goes to his sister. Same question. She comes back and says, I'll have sex with anybody, boop, any man for $50,000. So hypothetically speaking, 50 plus 50 is 100. So hypothetically speaking, his son should have, in the outcome of that those conversations, $100,000. But realistically, you get the idea. So the reason why I remember now why I picked this. The reason why I picked this is that they tend to deal with actions and scenarios that might happen. And something within hypotheticals is that it's a question that reveals opinions or beliefs. The question is not based on facts, but an imaginary situation. And there's a level of like reality within the hypothetical. And what happens, especially online, is that people twist hypotheticals in such a way where there's no, like, how I say this? The big thing to remember about hypotheticals is that they're not designed to pin people into boxes on an opinion, but they're used in such a way online so that you can really deeply understand the extent of somebody's core beliefs, which I don't think they're really used or supposed to be used like that. Like, I think hypotheticals, generally speaking, can be used in a way to broadly understand what people feel on a certain thing, but even then it's a little murky, right? So I want to get some tips. Some like the big three of tips I thought about when people give you hypotheticals. Think, clarify, answer. Never feel obligated to like answer a hypothetical. What you can do, think. Don't, under any circumstance, say the first thing that comes to mind. Just don't do that. Never, ever, ever. Also, don't ramble. So don't go, I fall in this trap many a time. Like, don't just like blah, 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 blah. Blah 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 blah. It's just bad outcomes. Clarify, like, don't feel, and also just don't feel pressured, right? So don't say the first thing that comes to mind, don't ramble, and don't feel pressured to answer. So what I mean by don't feel pressured to answer, don't feel pressured that you need to have this like clear and direct like analysis of the hypothetical that leads to this consensus of an answer, because it's not what they're designed. They're just asked to reveal certain opinions and beliefs. A lot of times they're based on facts and not objective, not just an imaginary scenario. They're not based on facts. So think, clarify, answer. Think about the hypothetical, ask questions about the hypothetical. This is something that I don't think enough people do, because usually what happens is most people, I would argue, don't even think out their own hypotheticals. Meaning, maybe I think the only person who I could say probably does this is maybe our relevant, because I've heard the lore that him and his brother kind of do this like pseudo like Aristotle shit where they just like wake up and go, did we just wake up? Huh. What is awake? Well, what are dreams? Like that's I've heard the lore. I've heard the Reli lore. But basically it's like, just clarify the hypothetical with questions. And as many questions as you need. And also just don't feel obligated to answer, but if you want to answer, answer. All in all, if I had to wrap this up into some type of like cherry on top, I hope that you came out of here maybe learning a couple words you didn't walk into it knowing. Certain the ideas like the 4Ds of conversation and all the shit in between, right? That's basically the goal. Because these are all just things that have been just on my mind. Taking time to think isn't always an option in online debates, though. At least not on a classic debate. During a panel, you have time to think your approach over. I would also say that too, that like within the online debate panel, it's totally fine to participate in a hypothetical, but don't feel obligated that you have to answer the hypothetical. I think it's totally fine to just say no and just like be on your merry way. I don't think every single hypothetical deserves or needs to have an answer, but yeah, I hope this was helpful. So, what's up, dude?